Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our virtual College of Liberal Arts faculty colloquium. My name is Arska Dobrsek and I will be a moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I would like to provide a few remarks. We are recording the session and broadcasting live on Facebook. If you have any questions for the speaker, please state your question in the chat box and we will address those questions during the Q&A session after the presentation. And you will also get a chance to raise your hand and ask those questions yourself. If we have any students in the audience who wish to receive a partial or extra credit for attending today's presentation, please send me a message via chat stating your name, professor's name, and the course for which you would like to receive this credit. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michael Strezewski. Dr. Strezewski is an archaeologist and associate professor of anthropology at USI. He received his PhD from Indiana University and joined the USI faculty in 2006. He has worked in the field of Midwestern archaeology since 1992 and has published numerous articles and reports on the results of his excavations and research. His areas of interest include the Harmonist occupation of New Harmony, the Middle Woodland period in southwestern Indiana, and the 19th century fur trade period. Dr. Strezewski, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Urska, for the introduction. So the title of my talk, let me share my screen here. There we go. So as you can see, the title of my talk, whoops, we have to change those display settings, don't we? Does that look good? Thumbs up. Okay, good. Thank you. All right. I'm sorry. Whoops. The title of the talk is, an excellent house of private entertainment, the Harmonist Tavern in New Harmony. And this is a project that I started before COVID and kind of worked up and finished during the pandemic. So it's a pandemic project. But as Urska said when she was introducing me, that I'm an archaeologist, but this project actually involves no archaeology whatsoever. So perhaps I'm stepping on someone's toes, a historian's toes a little bit in what I'm doing here. But nonetheless, it turned out to be pretty interesting. And you'll see why it doesn't involve any archaeology as we go along here. So the Harmonist Tavern. All right. So frontier taverns. Frontier taverns were kind of an important institution in the early part of the United States, in the Midwestern U.S., in the early 19th century. At that time, the road networks were not very good at all. Travel was slow, and there wasn't a whole lot of folks there. So we had settlements, but a lot of blank space, let's say, in between those settlements. When one was traveling, you could stop at a tavern and find lodging for the night. And these taverns were, the tavern was a little bit different than we think of a tavern today. We think of it as a drinking establishment. The frontier tavern was more like as I say here, like a small boarding house. That is, you could get alcoholic beverages there typically, but they also served food, and there was lodging there as well. So these taverns kind of varied quite a bit in terms of how formal they were. So typically, if you're like in a rural area, you wanted to stop over for the night, you could, in fact, just inquire in the neighborhood to see if anyone would accept you for lodging. And you would just stop at their house and they would offer you a bed or maybe a space on the floor, and you would get a meal on what they had on hand. And then in the end, when you were done and you were leaving, you would pay them a little bit of money, and that would be that. So it could be that informal. But in some instances, you had a tavern that was more of a formal establishment, especially in the towns, that was the sole purpose of the structure would be to lodge travelers and visitors to the town, right? So this is an early tavern, a depiction in a publication from 1820, a log tavern in Indiana. Here's another picture of a tavern, a very early tavern. This one's in Wamborough, Illinois, in Edwards County, Illinois, not so far from here. But this was a tavern that was sketched by Charles Alexander Lesueur in 1826. And you can see that it consists of a double pen log cabin. Here's another sketch by Lesueur from that same visit. And in this sketch, he's sitting in the tavern, and he's sketched the countryside from the porch. And you can see they've got some tables laid out with food, etc., for the meal that's about to be served at the tavern, right? Okay, so the accommodations at taverns varied greatly. Some were described as being okay, others were described as being quite awful. Most of these descriptions that we have are from travelers' accounts, folks passing through the area, oftentimes Europeans, English people in most instances, traveling through the area and kind of remarking about what the United States was all about, these kind of traveler accounts. It was a very popular genre of writing at that time. So I've gleaned a number of accounts of, some of these are really good, but I only can show you a small number of them. But here's one. This is a description of a tavern in the English Prairie, which again is not very far from New Harmony. But this fellow here, William Foe, in 1818 had to say, "I supped and I went to bed in a hog-sty of a room containing 4 filthy beds and 8 mean persons. The sheets stinking and dirty. The beds lie on boards, not cards, and are so hard that I could not sleep. 3 in one bed, all filth, no comfort. And yet this is an English tavern." These were English settlers. "No whiskey, no milk, and vile tea." Just nastiness, right? Place that none of us would want to stay. Here's one more. I'll just give you one more here to kind of give you an idea of what these were like. This is one also from the English Prairie. Apparently the English Prairie was not a good place to stay at this time. But this is a fellow by the name of Adlard Welby in 1819. And he says, "Our own fare proved little better than that of our horses. Some very rancid butter, a little sour bread, and some slices of lean fried beef, which it was vain to expect the teeth could penetrate. Washed down by bad coffee. We asked for eggs, milk, sugar, and salt, and the answer to all was, 'We have none.'" Right? So a lot of what we've got about taverns and reports of taverns and how they were operated is from these sorts of travelers' accounts. But, you know, one of the biggest issues in kind of understanding what this institution was all about is the fact that, the travelers are probably biased in reporting those taverns that were particularly lousy. It's not as interesting reading to report that the accommodations were good, I suppose. So if the food was terrible, they would report upon it. It's, the 19th century version of Yelp or something like that, right? Okay, so getting into talking about the Harmonist Tavern, I'll just give a little bit of background information about New Harmony. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, I'm sure some of you are. But New Harmony was a town that was founded by the Harmony Society, which was the leader of which was George Rapp. It was a religious society that came from Germany originally, and Rapp was born in Germany and established his followers in Germany. He came into conflict. He had a lot of kind of novel ideas about religion in terms of the power of the laity and infant baptism and certain issues that he didn't agree with, and he came into conflict with the Lutheran Church, and he and his followers were increasingly persecuted in their homeland, and they decided in 1805 to emigrate to the United States, where they settled at first in Western Pennsylvania, not too far from Pittsburgh, and established a town there, which they called Harmony. Now, they stayed in Harmony for about 10 years. And in 1814, they decided they were going to move and establish a new town. And they bought land in what is now Posey County, but at that time was the Indiana Territory, with the first Harmonists arriving in June of 1814. And they went right to work building their second town. So in the midst of this, they're building the town. And one of the things that they realized first, right off the bat, really, is the fact that they needed to have a tavern. This was just kind of like an institution that when you build a town, you need to have a tavern. And Rapp wrote back to Pennsylvania stating that, strangers often come late at night, and then we have no bed, got no place to accommodate visitors. We must build a double log cabin for this purpose. So he was saying this in December of 1814. And not too soon after that, within about 6 months, the tavern was open in New Harmony. Now, this tavern was not like any ordinary tavern. This is an actual photo of the building itself from 1903. Unfortunately, it's not standing anymore, and you'll see what happened. But the building did stand through the early 20th century. And most of the visitors to the tavern, and there are quite a few accounts of this tavern, indicate that it was one of the best, if not the best tavern in Indiana. So it's not, average. It's not a typical tavern, but nonetheless, it's good, solid information about this, about taverns in the early 19th century. Here's what one visitor had to say about the tavern. This is William Blaney in 1822. He said it was an excellent house of private entertainment. That's where I got my title from, right? It's kept by one of their number named Frederick Eggensberger. Eggensberger was the tavern keeper in Harmony, the first town. He was a tavern keeper in New Harmony, their second town here in Indiana. And he was the tavern keeper for a while in their third town in Economy, which, we'll get to later. But Eckensberger was a Harmonist who came with the first wave of settlers to the United States in 1805. And he was one of the very few Harmonists who could speak English. So he was kind of a natural, a person to deal with outside people, the vast majority of whom were English speakers rather than German speakers, which, were the Harmonists themselves. So everything here was so clean, comfortable, and well arranged that I was quite delighted, right? It was a welcome change for what they were used to traveling in the Midwest. Now, the Harmonist Tavern, I should say, or I should mention here, was for non-Harmonists only. It was not, a number of people in the tavern remarked the fact that they didn't see any Harmonists there. They were wondering where they were. The issue was that Rapp he liked to keep a kind of a tight leash on his followers, so to speak. And I believe he probably thought that intermingling of his followers and the general public was probably not a good thing. And also there was hard alcohol being served there, and they were not a big fan of drunkenness or intemperance and that sort of thing. Harmonists were not against drinking. They drank beer, they drank wine at home, but they pretty much did not drink hard alcohol except for medicinal purposes. So we've been told. All right, so there were no Harmonists in this tavern. This is for the visitors only. Here's a little bit about the accommodations, just to kind of give you an idea what it would have been like to stay in the Harmonist Tavern. William Foe in 1819, he reports that he slept in a good, clean bedroom, and there were 4 beds in the room, 1 in each corner. But he found the beef wasn't so good, bad beef, though good bread, and high charges, $1.05 each, right? So he thought it was a little overpriced and the beef wasn't so good, but overall he thought it was pretty decent, right? Here's one more here from Adlard Welby in 1819. He said it was furnished, that the tavern itself was furnished in the plainest manner, and beyond a 3-cornered armchair, there was not a piece of furniture which could excite the repose of indolence or the indulgence of luxury, right? It was very Spartan sort of accommodations, which was in keeping with the Harmonists themselves. They did not have luxurious accommodations in their own house. It's very kind of practical furniture and that sort of thing, right? So they had some good beer and a bottle of white wine, both of which had been produced by the Harmony Society. All right, so here's where the tavern was located in the town. It was at the corner of Main Street and Tavern Street. That's where the name comes from. And it was right in the center of town, kind of like a commercial nexus of the town. You can see to the north of the tavern, there's kind of a town square, an open area right there. And then to the southeast, you've got the store. That's where folks would come to buy whatever goods they wanted to buy. Some of them were made by the Harmonists. Others were bought and sold in the store. The Harmonist warehouse is right next to that as well. Then to the south, you've got the doctor's office. The doctor served Harmonists and non-Harmonists. And then you've got a couple of other shops there. You've got the blacksmith and the wheelwright shop, both of which were probably used by the locals, non-harmonists from around Posey County. If you got some tools that need mending, or a wagon or a wheel for your wagon or something that needs mending, you'd probably go to those shops. So that's a kind of like, in some sense, kind of like a commercial district for the town. And so it made sense that the tavern was right near there, because that's where people would stay, and maybe you'd stop off and get a drink or two too. All right, so this is just a little sketch I made based upon that map, the Pickering Map, which is the one I just showed you, that shows the structures that were related to the tavern operation. So on the bottom right there, you have the tavern building itself, which was a frame structure. The map shows the interior rooms within the tavern, and you can see it has a long hallway going east-west with a number of rooms on either side. Unfortunately, we don't know what each of those rooms was used for. We would assume some were used for sleeping or eating or lounging around, or who the heck knows, but there's no identification, unfortunately, as to what they were used for. Next to that, or abutting that structure, is a brick structure, which I don't know what that was used for either. It could have been a residence for Eckensberger and or a kitchen or something like that. It's not identified. That structure has a porch on the north side, a 2-story wooden porch on the north side. And then to the west of the brick structure is a stable where you'd keep your horses when you came in town. And then to the north of that, you've got a smokehouse and a shed, and then a very large garden that presumably was used for produce for the operation of the tavern when they were serving meals. So that's what it was all about, right? Okay, so here's just a drawing. This is Charles Alexander Lesueur's drawing of one of his drawings of New Harmony, but this one clearly shows the tavern. I've got it identified there on the slide, and then we can see that some of the other structures that I just pointed out are also shown in this picture. Here's the brick structure, and you can see the porch on the north side of the structure right there. And then these other 3 structures may be the stable and the shed and the smokehouse. I'm pretty sure that's what they are, but I'm not 100% sure. But nonetheless, there's another view of the tavern operation. So what happened to the tavern? Well, here's what happened to the tavern. In 1908, there was a big fire, and the tavern burned down. It was actually used as a tavern up through that point in time. The building was known, or the business was known as the Monitor Tavern up to that point. And then, like I said, it burned down. It burned down that structure and a couple of other structures as well, but that was the end of the tavern. Right. If you're curious and you know New Harmony, this is what's on the corner today. Movie theater, or former movie theater, and apartments, which are situated there. And I mentioned that I wasn't doing any archaeology. There's no archaeology element to this talk. And that's kind of the main reason why, is because there's a big old structure right on top of that spot where the tavern used to be. So if we wanted to do archaeology, it's, virtually impossible. So we just have to work on the, historic records. Okay, so if we want to talk about taverns and, what's been done regarding Midwestern taverns up to this point, there's kind of 2 angles that we can take. The first one is an archaeology angle, right? We can identify the location of a tavern, where it used to be on the landscape. You could do excavations around there, find various features that are related to the tavern and artifacts that are related to its operation. And a number of those excavations have been done. In particular, around here, Mary McCorvey and Mark Wagner did a number of excavations of taverns in southern Illinois. But it's, as I was saying just a moment ago, it's not really possible to do this in New Harmony, given that the tavern site is really thoroughly disturbed. The other angle is a history angle, looking at documents and that sort of thing. And we do have quite a few travelers' accounts of taverns in the Midwest. But the biggest problem we have is that there's a lack of primary documents, in that there's a little piece of a day book here, a few records here, a few records there, covering this month to that month, and that sort of thing. There's just not a whole lot out there as far as like the operation of a tavern. And you would expect this, I suppose, when you were talking about a tavern that was kind of an informal one. You're taking in visitors just on a sort of ad hoc basis. You're not going to keep detailed records and that sort of thing. But even like the more formal taverns, there really isn't a whole lot out there. So we don't have a lot to go on to really kind of characterize what this taverns were all about. So that's why the New Harmony information is so valuable. This is one of the pages of from the microfilm at the Workingmen's Institute of the records of the tavern. So we have the daybooks for the tavern for the entire time that the tavern was in operation, from 1815 to 1825, and even from before that and after that. There's information from the other two towns, but I was focusing, of course, mostly on the New Harmony decade here. And this is just kind of a sample page, and you can see up at the top it says Frederick Eckensberger there. That's, like I said, the tavern keeper. On the left, you've got a column there that says DR. That is the debit column. And on the right there, you have the CR. That's the credit column, right? So on the debit column, you're just listing all of your expenses. And on the credit column, you're listing all the money that you bring in. So as you can see there, it's fairly detailed. For example, you can see on October 19th, it says that they bought 3 pounds of butter and 4 dozen eggs for 70 cents. On November 4th, they bought 2 fish for $1 and 1 gallon of peach brandy for $2.25. And on November 13th, they bought 4 gallons of whiskey for $4. Right, whiskey is relatively cheap. But this is super interesting, super detailed information. We don't have any information about the patrons of the tavern or like the food that was served. We got some of the raw ingredients like eggs and sugar and salt and all that kind of thing, but we don't exactly know how they put it together to make a meal. But nonetheless, this is still quite a bit of interesting information here that we have that really it doesn't exist anywhere else, as far as I know, in the Midwest. Right. So what I did was I took all that information, I transcribed all those records, and created a database that I could use to kind of crunch the numbers to say something about how this tavern was operated. So the basic gist of it here is in February 1815, that was the last entry for the tavern in Harmony, Pennsylvania. So that's presumably when they closed shop up there. And then they moved it to New Harmony, which the tavern records run from June of 1815 to April of 1825, right? And there's over 1,000 entries during that time. And then they moved it over to Economy, their third town, after June of 1825. So there was a little bit of a 2-month lag there between shutting it down in New Harmony and starting it up again in Economy. Right. So after kind of putting all this information together, I started crunching numbers and coming up to see if I could find some patterns. Right. So here's what we've found so far. All right. First thing I wanted to mention, you might ask the question, was the tavern busy at certain times of the year and not other times? Well, this graph here shows that it was pretty much busy most of the year. There's a little bit of an uptick in business in kind of June, July, August, those months. But you can see it, and on the left of that this chart here, even in January, February, March, they were still doing a fair amount of business all around the whole year, right? So it wasn't a sort of seasonal business. And now moving on to some specific beverages and that sort of thing. I'll start talking first about some of the lower alcohol beverages at New Harmony. Beer to start out with. And on the right there, you'll see there's an ad from the Vincennes Western Sun and Advertiser from May 1st of 1819, advertising Harmonist beer in Vincennes. Frederick Rapp will always have on hand and for sale the first quality strong beer by the barrel at Harmony, Indiana. Right? So the Harmonists were making beer. They made all sorts of things. Beer is one of them. Now, what I found was that the beer was first offered at the tavern in 1819. It wasn't offered prior to that. It was already open from 1815, 16, 17, and 18, but they didn't offer beer till 1819. Why not? Well, I went back to the records again and looked at the brewery records. Brewery doesn't show any production till like mid 1818. So I think that what was happening was that they were starting to get the Harmonist brewery operation going there, and once they had beer on hand, then they started offering it at the tavern, right? But beer turned out to be the most popular drink at the tavern. They sold about 457 gallons of beer every year, and they were selling it in by the barrel, 31-gallon barrels. That cost about $5 for a 31-gallon barrel of beer. But this remained for the whole decade, well, from 1819 through 1825, remained the most popular beverage sold at the tavern. As far as like the total production is concerned, the tavern wound up taking about 20% of the entire production of the town, and the rest of which was sold to other folks outside of New Harmony. Particularly, what I found was kind of surprising or sort of interesting, about 50% of the beer that was made in 1820, at least, I don't have all these records completely worked out yet, but about 50% of the beer sold in 1820, at least, was sold to the English Prairie. There's a number of individuals that I know happen to be associated with the English Prairie, and they were buying up beer like crazy. And apparently, there's some records, some letters, basically telling Rapp, like, keep the beer flowing here. You know, that was the favorite drink in the English Prairie. So they were saying, just send us more beer. You know, it wasn't a particularly popular drink in the United States prior to the Civil War. But that was like the main one that was being sold at the Harmonist Tavern. Another thing that they sold was wine, which Rapp himself was a vine dresser. I mean, that was his profession before he came to the United States. And one of the things he wanted to do when they moved to Indiana was to set up a wine production. They planted vines and established vineyards, and they did wind up making wine in Posey County. But wine wasn't a particularly popular drink in the United States. You know, Rapp received some reports before he came to Indiana. Some of them said, yeah, people will buy up your wine. And then other people said, like, you know, they're not super interested in wine. Well, I don't think they were all that interested in wine, right? A lot of times wine was served in this time period in the early 19th century. It was served as fortified wine, which what we're talking about is you're adding distilled spirits to the wine to increase the alcohol content to about 18% or so, right? As far as the tavern is concerned, how much wine did they sell? Not much is the answer. Very modest sales in New Harmony. They only sold it by volume. It was about 3.5% relative to the beer sales. Sometimes they do note that it was Harmonist wine in the records. It'll say H wine or Harmonist wine in the records. So I know that it was Harmonist wine. Other times it just says wine. It doesn't specify whether it's red or white or anything like that. So most of the times I don't have any more specifics about the wine other than that it was just wine, right? But they were only selling about 16 gallons a year of wine. I just mentioned that some is known to be Harmonist wine, right? Okay, so another thing, lower alcohol beverage, and then we'll move on to the hard stuff, was cider. Now, this is what we would call hard cider. Back then, cider was hard cider. They didn't have to have the extra adjective there. But cider was a very popular drink in the early part of the 19th century, and in this area of the country, due to a glut in apples. And what I mean is that when these farmers started moving into these areas here, one of the things they did was plant apple trees. And when these apple trees started bearing fruit, people wound up with a heck of a lot of apples that they didn't know what to do with. They couldn't ship them. The roads were lousy. The fruit is prone to spoilage. It gets damaged and that kind of thing. What are you going to do with all these apples? People decided we were going to crush them down, create apple juice, and make apple cider out of them, hard cider out of them. And so apple cider had about 10% alcohol or something. of that, somewhere around there. Sometimes this was also fortified, like I was talking about fortified wines. You would fortify cider, and when they added the distilled spirits to the cider, it was then called cider royal, and there is some evidence that this was served in the Harmonist tavern. As far as the tavern is concerned, how much cider did people drink? Not a huge amount. Again, relative to beer, it's actually quite small. They only purchased it in 4 out of 10 years that they were there in New Harmony, right? So cider was there, it was served, but it wasn't the most popular beverage. Okay, now moving on to the harder alcohols, right? Whiskey, right? So whiskey was a very big part of the early 19th century alcohol menu, I guess you'd call it. This whiskey was about 45% or so alcohol, different depending on how many times you ran it through the distillery and that sort of thing. But this was also seen as a patriotic thing to drink. It was a local U.S. made distilled spirit, right? So, but kind of the colonial era, before the revolution, there was a lot of consumption of things like gin and rum, which involved sugar, which came from the Caribbean. And once the United States became an independent country, people didn't want to rely upon outside sources for their goods, including alcohol. And they thought, hey, we're going to drink something that's made here in the good old US of A, right? And this again has to do with a glut of a particular product. So you're making cider because there's a glut in apples. You're making whiskey because you got a whole lot of corn that you don't know what to do with. These farmers, again, growing corn, transportation's lousy, etc. And so what are you going to do with all this corn? You're going to make whiskey out of it, right? So the Harmonist distilleries, there were 2 in town. There was one on the northeast corner of town and one on the southwest corner of town, but those Harmonist distilleries got running right away. There was a big demand for whiskey in the area, so they were running by spring of 1816. So this was not very long after the town was established. And then there were other hard alcohol products sold at the tavern, but these are all kind of small, minor amounts. There's a type of liqueur called Persico. It's a kind of brandy based liqueur. Other types of brandy, gin, rum, they show up here and there, but they're not super popular. All right, so on to talking about whiskey, right? Okay, so we look at the whiskey prices. What happens here is that the price of whiskey goes down through time, right? More and more farmers growing more and more corn who don't know what to do with this corn, and so they're making whiskey out of it. The supply is just going up, and the demand isn't there to meet the supply. I just had some numbers here just to kind of give you an idea of how much whiskey is being produced. So in 1812, and this was 2 years before the Harmonists arrived in New Harmony, in 1812 New Orleans received 11,000 gallons of whiskey, and by 1825, the year that the Harmonists left, New Orleans received 570,000 gallons of whiskey. So went from 11,000 to 570,000 gallons of whiskey in about 13 years. So there was way more whiskey than anybody could deal with, and the price just kind of continued to go down, down, down over the years. So here's where we get into some interesting stuff that requires explanation. So going through this data, what I was seeing was that whiskey, kind of the amount of whiskey that was served in the tavern, continued to go up through about 1819 and then went down to virtually nothing. So you can see in this chart here, 1815, 1816, kind of modest sales, but it goes way up in 1818 and 1819. They sold over 250 gallons of whiskey at the tavern. And then it goes down in 1820, and after 1821, basically nothing is being sold at the tavern. So this is something that requires an explanation. I sat down. I'm thinking, what the heck happened here that they weren't selling any more whiskey? But did they stop making it in New Harmony, or what? What was the cause of this? And I came up with what I think is a pretty good argument for why they stopped selling whiskey. There was a riot in New Harmony. in 1820. This is not an actual photo of the riot. But what happened was, in January of 1820, a fellow by the name of William Harris, who was apparently a local guy, we don't know much about him, but he came into town and he assaulted two Harmonists. There was some type of an argument about two people that were indentured to the society, and he got into this fight, and Eckensberger, the tavern keeper, wound up getting drawn into the fight, and apparently Eckensberger assaulted Harris, right? So there was a fist fight between the two, right? Maybe it occurred at the tavern, maybe it didn't. We don't know exactly, right? But it did involve the tavern keeper. Now, what happened then is the next day, 9 guys showed up outside of town, armed with clubs, sticks, rifles, guns, and other offensive weapons, and got into an argument with 6 Harmonists who were working in the field and assaulted them. And then later that day, 12 men, some of the repeat customers there, showed up and entered the town and went on a rampage for a couple of hours. They went into Eggensberger's home and they threatened him. So he was the target of these rioters, right? Now, after this happened, there was lawsuits and counter lawsuits, people suing one another, charges being brought back and forth from the rioters and the Harmonists, and it started to go through the court system. And eventually, what happened is that basically nothing happened to these folks. They weren't punished. Some of them, like Harris, for example, didn't show up for court, and the charges were dropped. Another person who was involved in the riots was fined a few dollars, and then that was the end of it, right? And the Harmonists felt that they were deeply wronged by the court system, that the neighbors were treating them shabbily, and they didn't get they didn't get justice in this case. And what happened then was the Harmonist response to this was, we cannot get along with our neighbors. These are folks that, we should keep separate from. And these are a couple of excerpts from letters that are addressing this very thing with regards to the court decision of the riot in New Harmony. This is one from Romelius Baker to John Baker, 2 Harmonists. And one thing Baker said was, there's no other way for us than to have as little to do with the world as possible. We're just going to have to separate ourselves from these people. We cannot commingle with them. In another letter, Frederick Rapp, the adopted son of George Rapp, said, we are determined more and more to limit ourselves to ourselves. The world can no longer bear us, and we cannot bear it until it is judged, right? So that was their feeling about the matter, is we can't get along with these people until, Christ returns, and then, everything's going to be reconciled, right? We're going to need to cut ourselves off. And so I believe that this change in what they were serving at the tavern is a direct result of this riot. And here's why I think that. So here's what we have. Now, I mentioned that there was some whiskey purchased in 1820, but here's what happened. And 2 weeks before the riot, they bought 1 barrel, 33.5 gallons of whiskey purchased. So that was the first purchase of the year. Then the riot happens. So about a month after the riot, they purchased another barrel, 32 gallons. And then apparently a decision was made. We're done here. We're not selling whiskey anymore in the tavern, and that's it, right? So from March 1820 to April 1825, they bought 3 gallons total. That was it. They pretty much cut them off. The locals were no longer allowed to drink whiskey in the tavern. And in fact, the tavern actually had a sign that said private entertainment that was painted on the front of the tavern, and it was painted there because they wanted basically a way to turn away drunken people. They didn't like drunkenness in their tavern. People could come in there, they could drink, but if you started getting out of hand, they didn't want you in there, right? So they were already not too hot about drunkenness. And so I think this kind of sent them over the edge and said, like, that's it. We're only going to sell beer, we're going to sell wine and that sort of thing, but no more whiskey, no more hard alcohol. So that it was not only whiskey that was cut off, it was Persico and brandy and gin and rum, and all of those things are just done with for the rest of the decade, or the rest of the Harmonist decade, that is. So they weren't opposed to selling whiskey, though. So they didn't cut off making whiskey. The distilleries continued to operate, making plenty of whiskey. They sold it to their neighbors and that sort of thing, but they just did not want it to be consumed inside of their town because of the disruptive, effects that it would have. Here's a nice little quote from Frederick Rapp to somebody. Somebody was inquiring as to whether or not they had any whiskey on hand for sale, and Rapp said, "We've had an uncommon call for whiskey during the harvest time." Apparently, it was a big time to drink whiskey during the harvest time by our neighbors, and we could not refuse without offense to sell that to them. So all the whiskey is sold now to the barrel. We have nothing left because we had to oblige our neighbors and sell them all of our whiskey that we had on hand. So they were still selling it to the people. They just didn't want it happening in the town itself, right? Another piece of evidence kind of suggests that this really what was going on here is that when you start looking at what happened in economy, so once they left New Harmony, they go to Economy, Pennsylvania, they start their new tavern. Once that happened, boom, they started selling whiskey right away again. So in 1825, which was a partial year, ran from June to December, they sold 73 gallons of whiskey. The next year, which was a whole entire year, they sold 180 gallons of whiskey. So right away, after they left Southwest Indiana, left Posey County, they resumed whiskey sales at the tavern. So it almost certainly had something to do with the particular situation they were in Posey County. And there are quite a few accounts that indicate that the Harmonists and their neighbors didn't get along very well for various reasons, which was one of the probably main reasons why they left Posey County and went back to Pennsylvania. They were just not getting along with their neighbors. There's a lot of different reasons involved, but I think this was probably one of the main ones, right? So when we look at this, then, look at the bottom line here of the amount of money that was being taken in by the tavern, you can see that the profits go up through 1815, 16, 17, 18, 19, and then they start going down after that, 1820, 21, 22, 23. And then that may have something to do with the fact that they're not selling whiskey anymore, combined with the fact that people were kind of sour on the Harmonists and they were angry with them and they didn't want to frequent their establishment or whatever reason. But you can see that decision and those conflicts with their neighbors really affected their bottom line, right? Unfortunately, I don't have any data from 1824 and 25, so I can't carry it out through the very end of the Harmonist decade in Indiana, but at least through 1823, things were steadily kind of going downhill year after year, with the tavern making less profit every single year. So that's kind of in a nutshell. I've got a lot of other stuff that I've said when I'm written this up, but that sort of sums up some of the kind of major things I had to say about the Harmonist Tavern, and I would be happy and welcome to answer any questions that you might have about the tavern.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Strezewski, for this wonderful presentation. We do have a few questions.
Okay.
Beverly Fisher raised her the hand. Beverly, would you like to ask a question? And I believe also Jason at some point raised his hand.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I've enjoyed that presentation. Thank you very much. Excuse my voice. I'm interested in knowing if you have information on the Yellow Tavern that was on Church Street in the 70s, 80s, maybe a little bit before, maybe from the 1850s. Would you happen to have any information on that?
I haven't messed around with that. I mean, I know that Owen established that tavern. He started out using this original Harmonist tavern, and then he opened the other one in, I think it was 1827 or 8. I can't remember off the top of my head now, but I haven't unfortunately played around with any data that might be out there about that tavern. I just
Okay.
know that he opened it, and that's about it. So,
Well,
unfortunately,
I've been doing some research on Dr. Murphy, and he lived in that tavern
hmm,
with his wife for many years.
okay.
So I'm hoping to locate information about that. If you have any clues, I would appreciate knowing about them.
Yeah, I mean, all I could say is that there might be something in the Workingmen's Institute. I don't know if you've looked there already, but that'd be the first place I'd look. I know they do have some Owen period records. There are some records of the tavern operation, the Owen Tavern that was in the original building. I know there's some records there, but I've never messed around with them. Just having,
Okay, but nothing on the Yellow Tavern on the Church Street.
I just don't know. There may be, but I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
And then we have another question by Susan. Was the tavern still used for overnight stays before it burned down in 1908?
And the only thing I know is that it was used as a sort of boarding house, lodging house when the Owenites took it over in 1825 and through about 1826 or so. After that period, I really am not sure. It may have been, but I just don't have any data on that.
Mm-hmm. And then Daniel has a comment. One hurdle the Harmonists faced in Indiana was that ready markets were not available to sell the wine. They sent wine to different places to try and sell it, including Shawneetown, Illinois, where they had a store, New Orleans, Pittsburgh, and Cincinnati, among other places in the East.
Mm-hmm.
The lack of markets is one of the reasons they left New Harmony to return to Pennsylvania in 1824.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's part of it. Yeah. Like I said, there's a lot of reasons why they decided to leave, and I certainly think that was one of them. There was currency issues and yeah, transportation issues. There's a whole kind of slew of things. But yeah, I think that the conflict with their neighbors was just one of those issues. Yeah. I mean, as far as like the wine was concerned, there didn't appear to be a whole lot of local demand for it. So I imagine they probably shipped some of it elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. And then Lauren has a question. Are the distillery or brewery still standing or unaltered today for possible excavation?
That's a good question. I was just messing around with that today. In fact, just looking to see what the possibilities there were. The one distillery on the north east corner of town, there's been a number of structures built there over the years. I don't know how much promise it has for excavation. It might be obliterated. The brewery is over by the entrance to, or the brewery was over by the entrance to the hotel in the Red Geranium area. That also might be kind of messed up. And then the other distillery is on the southwest corner of town. That one actually might have some archaeological remains still there. It's in an area that I don't think has seen a lot of construction over the last 200 years. I mean, one of the problems of doing archaeology in New Harmony is the fact that it's a living town, you know, that people are building things and tearing it down and all that sort of thing. You know, in 1850, they weren't thinking about, you know, like, oh, we got to save this because it's an archaeological site, you know. So they were building and messing up the archaeological remains in the process. But yeah, that one might have some promise in the southwest corner of town, but I haven't looked in great detail, but I think that one's had the least, it's been the least impacted, I think, by subsequent construction.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, you have a comment about this question?
I do not actually. Mike would definitely be the expert on, like he said, what could still be remaining for archaeological value. You might be able to find a few artifacts here and there, but as far as more extensive learning, with the town being still active and busy, it could be hard to find out more information about the other buildings.
Yeah, none of them are standing, so they've been gone for a long, long time. But there may be something there. Just a matter of looking, really. So oftentimes you don't know until you look.
Right. And then we have a question by Jennifer. Do you know who the Harmonists mostly sold the whiskey? And then she had a comment, great presentation.
Oh, thank you. I haven't gotten into the whiskey production too much. I have looked at some of the documents that I found at the Workingmen's Institute with regard to whiskey production. I honestly, I don't have any information about it. It may be there, but if you ever look at the microfilm of the Harmonist records at the Workingmen's Institute, you're talking about literally probably tens of thousands of pages of documents. It takes a long time to go through them and pick out the stuff, and they're not organized super well. So you have to go through these and pick out individual pages that has information that's useful to you. It took me quite a while to find all of the individual pages from the tavern, and I did collect some stuff about whiskey production, but I don't have any great idea about who it was sold to. It's something I may do in the future, but not quite yet. So again, I'll have to say I don't know yet, but we'll see in the future, perhaps.
Right. Scott is asking, when did the tavern get the name Monitor? Was it named after the worship?
I have absolutely no idea. Once the Harmonists left, I never messed around with it. As far as like why it was called the Monitor Saloon. Yeah, I honestly, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Jason also like the topic, perfect topic for Friday afternoon. And then
It's just water. I'm sorry. So.
And then he also has a question for an entirely mercenary reason. Will your database or raw data be made available in any form for other researchers to use for their own purposes?
I don't know. I mean, if somebody's got a specific question that they want to use it for, we could talk about it. Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you this too. I also put together a database for the Harmonist store. I've done a similar thing with there was an inventory done of the Harmonist store in 1825 when Owen bought the town. They went through the whole store and did an inventory of the whole thing. There was a lot of stuff in that store, and I sat down and I transcribed the whole thing, but I haven't done anything with it yet. So this is kind of like a side thing for me, is like going through these records and kind of gleaning little bits and pieces of interesting information from them. But yeah, it's fun.
And then we have another question about distilleries. What is at the location of the distilleries? Could archaeology be done there?
Yeah, I was talking about before, the one on the southwest side of town, possibly. There's probably been fewer buildings built in that area. But the one on the northeast corner of town seems to have been quite a bit of construction in that area, so it's not as promising. Whenever I do any kind of excavation in New Harmony, I always go through all the old maps, the ones that I can find, that shows where structures were located at various points in time. And if it's had a lot of stuff built on it over the years, you can bet that the original structure is going to be pretty much hard to find or non-existent. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then we have another question and a comment, also a great presentation. Did you note any changes in food consumption along those of changes in alcohol consumption?
I haven't been able to find any good patterns. I mean, but as far as like food is concerned, all we really did was have like a lot of, eggs and butter and salt and fish and pork and stuff like that. I did kind of play around with that a little bit, but wasn't able to find anything that was really any good patterns there. And the other thing is like I was saying before, I don't really know what they did with it once they brought it into the tavern. What kind of dishes were being made or served or anything like that. So yeah, I don't have as much information about food. It's much better info about the alcohol sales.
Mm-hmm. And then Beverly would like to know where was store located when inventory completed?
Where was the store located?
Mm-hmm.
It was the original store that was in basically kitty corner from the tavern, as was like I showed on the map earlier. When I was showing the map of the Pickering map of New Harmony, that was the store at the time.
And then we have another question by Lauren. Have any types of preservation or CRM work been done on the SW distillery?
No, nobody's ever looked at it. There's never been any archaeology on the distilleries, which is something that might be done in the future. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We do a field school every summer, or most summers, where we do an excavation, and I take students out and we do some excavations. So that's a possibility for the future. But at the present time, nothing's ever been done. No.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then Carmen made a comment, excellent presentation, Mike. Riot, oh my, I didn't know.
Well, sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
Oh my, I did not know. I'm assuming Connie is referring to the content of the presentation and the things that you have covered.
Yeah. This is something new that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, or basically nobody's aware of, because I had to go through all these documents to glean this information. So I hope it was useful.
Yes, definitely. It was very interesting, and I was interested in what interested you in this topic.
Well, it's not because I like drinking whiskey or anything like that. Actually, the truth is I barely drink alcohol at all. But what interests me in it? Well, it was just one of the things was it was just kind of an interesting institution. The tavern that brought the people from New Harmony with the outsiders together, and the fact that when I came across it, there was so much information there that seemed to be so complete. I was looking at these records and I said, well, there's just a lot here that's really useful information. And I started looking into taverns, just to kind of think like, hey, maybe I could do something with this. I looked into what taverns had been said about taverns, and it was a lot of real general stuff about just, from travelers' accounts and stuff like that. There were very, very few specifics about tavern operations. And that's why I really got interested. And I said, there's a lot of potential here to say some really interesting stuff about the operation of this specific tavern, which basically doesn't exist in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm. And did these taverns turn into something else eventually? When you talked about taverns, to me, it sounded like it's some sort of a hotel type of thing.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of like a hybrid hotel bar sort of thing. But yeah, the building, it was subdivided after the Harmonists left, and I don't know exactly when that happened. I have maps from the 19th century that shows that it was subdivided into various buildings, but at least a portion of it was the Monitor Saloon. But yeah, it's later life. I unfortunately don't have as much information about it. The Harmonists were meticulous record keepers, particularly during the Harmonist decade. Not so much afterwards. After they went to economy, they got a little bit lazy. They didn't write down as much. But during the Harmonist decade, they wrote so much stuff down, and there was so many travelers' accounts during the New Harmony decade as well. People talking about the town itself. They stayed in the tavern. They often mentioned the tavern. And so there's a lot of information about the structure during that little time period. And then, oddly enough, afterwards, which is more recent in time, we have less information because it wasn't such a novelty anymore. As you get into 1840, 1850, 1860, like what was the building being used for? There's just not that much information out there. in terms of, what the building looked like or how it was used or anything like that. I mean, it would require, you could probably find some information, but I just haven't looked at this point since I've been focused on the Harmonist use of the building. So,
right. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for this wonderful presentation and great discussion. So for our next talk will be on April the 23rd by Drs. Erin Gillis and Anne Statham. And the title of their presentation is From Awareness to Activism, Enhancing Commitment to Social Justice Among Liberal Arts Students. So with that, we are concluding our session, and thank you very much for attending.